Hi there. Welcome to Mackinsey Live. I'm Lucia Rahili, and I'm back today to moderate our discussion on returning to the workplace and what we can learn from businesses that have either stayed open safely throughout this crisis or that have navigated the return to work successfully. We hope you find our conversation useful and actionable, and of course, most important, that all of you continue to be well in the context of the countless reopenings underway across the globe. As we begin, a quick acknowledgement of the volatility of the current virus context. We saw in the US news on Monday that California is entering lockdown 2.0, as the LA Times described it. California is the 5th largest economy in the world, and the resurgence of the virus has implications not only for lives, but also for livelihoods and potentially for U.S. economic growth more broadly. And California is obviously not alone. We're seeing reopenings pause or reverse in other areas as well as new hotspots emerge and infection rates wax and wane, and in some regions reach new highs, unfortunately. Nevertheless, as the economic and the social consequences of this prolonged shutdown begin to feel grueling in different ways to all of us, the pressure to reopen is coalescing and continuing to mount. So what next? How should business leaders think about opening their doors to employees, and in some cases also to customers, in the middle of this extremely mutable and unpredictable environment? Joining me today are two McKinsey leaders, Mihir Mysore, a partner and expert on crisis response, and this year specifically a leader of McKinsey's COVID-19 response efforts, and Virginia Simmons, a senior partner and leader of McKinsey's offices in the U.S. Midwest. Mihir and Virginia are going to talk today about how we might think about the safety risks related to reopening, as well as how some businesses are managing those risks successfully. Mihir, Virginia, thanks for joining us and welcome to McKinsey Live. Virginia, over to you.
Thank you, and welcome everybody. We started this research back in May and March time, when we started to see some areas around the world had started to suppress the virus. And so we were starting to think about some places going back to work and really restart their business, welcome back employees and customers, as we just talked about. And so we looked at, as we thought about businesses that hadn't been open during the period, so non-essential businesses, and then we recognized that actually an awful lot of businesses designated as essential had been working at full tilt, frequently beyond their normal capacity throughout this period. And quite astonishingly, their own contagion rates were typically at or below the communities in which they were situated. And so we thought we should look at what were the practices that they had adopted in order to really contain the risk, and therefore what could non-essential businesses learn from that as they reopen. So we looked at that, and we're now in a period, it's no longer May, we're now in July. And one of the things that we're all learning about this virus is it's changing rapidly. So you look at the chart and you see some areas that had previously suppressed the virus with increasing cases. Again, we talked about some of that in North America. We're also seeing some other places that had not had the virus in the first time around, but are growing now. And so as a consequence, we expect these practices to be required across the next period of time. We no longer see a moment where the virus will peak and then go away. We unfortunately see it ebbing and flowing. And as a consequence, businesses are going to need to build a muscle where they understand how to put into practice many of these capabilities and practices in order to make themselves safer, and also know when and how to go remote and hybrid, on-site and off-site throughout the next at least probably 6 to 12 months. And therefore, we think this is actually of increasing importance rather than less important. So let me turn to the next page and tell you a little bit about how we thought about it. We wanted to think about what kinds of environments workplaces would be coming back into. And we thought about two dimensions that we thought were critical. On the left-hand axis, you'll see extent of exposure. And this is an idea around how many different people would any individual employee or customer, frankly, come into contact And if you think about something, the difference between a retail store where many different people might come into the store each day versus a warehouse where there are lots of people, but they're the same people typically day in, day out, they would be in different places on this axis. That's the extent of exposure. On the x-axis, we would think about, so the horizontal axis, we thought about how closely, so we thought about the proximity of exposure, so both the how closely and for how long people would come into contact with each other. And then we plotted various different industries across these metrics. One of the things that's worth pointing out is actually any particular business may actually sit in different ones of these. So if I again use retail as an example, the stores might sit up in the top right hand where they are both high exposure, so high extent of exposure and high proximity of exposure. So lots of people for a long period of time in reasonably close exposure, reasonably close distance. Whereas the warehouse, for example, might sit in the large contained spaces area. And their call centers might sit in an isolated area. And so any particular business might sit across these places. And so we thought different practices would be applied in each. So we plotted all of these and then we started to put them in groups where similar practices might make sense. So I go to the next chart. We then thought about what needs to be, what are the important criteria that any business would need to think through. And we, of course, all first thought about the workstation. But actually, as we went through this research, we realized that it is as important to be thinking about the pre-entry. And that means what happens before you even have anybody come back to work. So what kind of education, what kind of standards, what kinds of guidelines, what kinds of mindset changes do we need to set before entry? And traveling to work. If you are in a place where people typically came to it by public transport, what's that transportation situation? Then, of course, at work in the workstation. So if they're on a line, some kind of retail checkout, for example, on a manufacturing line or in a warehouse, or for some people, if I take some of their jobs below, the isolated and the solo, they might actually be a computer programmer who sits and does their work on their own, not necessarily on a site. And perhaps one of the riskiest areas is the common places where you used to get a cup of coffee, you used to be able to maybe have lunch in the lunchroom, and of course bathrooms, which are enclosed spaces with a high degree of traffic. And then post-infection, we thought about what are the activities that people needed to think about. And we mapped across both the types of businesses and the types of activity or the stage of the workplace journey, the nature of the risk, and the size of the bubble tells you the degree of the risk. So obviously those businesses at the top have significant public interaction in long enclosed spaces, have pretty high risk across all of these, whereas there's some jobs that are more solo, more isolated, and there can be more control. So move to the next chart.
Virginia, if I could interrupt you before we move to the next slide. A question has come in that is quite interesting about compliance with these behaviors. Much of this requires people to, as you said, change mindsets. How much do leaders have to think about softer measures like training and education as they're trying to inculcate employees in complying with these safety protocols and practices?
It's a really great question because I think we could probably recognize that around the world, different communities have adopted practices with different levels of compliance. And we've seen as a consequence different results. So it really is, as we're going through this, we're starting to realize that it's perhaps the most important factor. And so if we think about the pre-entry component, and maybe we move to the next chart, because it's a great segue into what we were thinking about. So in the next chart, as we think about pre-entry, one of the most critical things is training and mindset. Because we're finding if people comply with the behaviors relatively tightly, you can actually live a pretty normal life and go about your business the right way. But if people don't comply, we actually start to see hotspots and spreads. So specifically, there's a couple of companies that have done some interesting things. If I take Tencent in China, they've put together a training video for all of their employees to look at and watch, and they can see delivered to an electronic device. They can see who's seen it or not. There's some other companies, one of the ad agencies has actually asked people to go through a series of training, and only if they have been through that training and have understood it through some kind of testing, then they're allowed back on site. So I think the mindset of You take enormous precautions yourself in order to protect the people around you, and the community around you is very important. And so we think as we're seeing things ebb and flow, there's a degree to which mindset changes are very important. Now, this is challenging for business leaders because you start to potentially overstep the line and start talking about what people should do in their private life. And that's a very hard line and a judgment call. And the way we've seen companies do that in an excellent way is to think this idea of protecting ourselves, our communities, our families, and all of these behaviors to be carried throughout the life. So that's how we're thinking about it. But it is of critical importance. And so if I think about that, as we've talked about in pre-entry, there's obviously a series of policies to set out. There's preparing the workplace, there's the making sure the separation in the workplace and so on. But really, I would actually stress the part that you've just talked about, the communication, the training, mindset, how we're going to operate together is of most importance. One thing about traveling to work, we've seen some people do very interesting things around both the transport to work, but also the entry into work. So some places have had the opportunity to stagger their opening times. So if you think about some dentist offices where it's not critical that you open at 9 o'clock, it's not critical you're in the rush hour, and they've been able to move and stagger start. In places with large offices, again, some in China have opened up the offices in 10-minute increments. I was just saying, actually, in Chicago, where I live, the Museum of Science and Industry is about to reopen its doors, and they are also now going to have customers coming in 10-minute increments, so they can say when people come in and out. So there's a mechanism to minimize the crowding at the entrance, but then also transport. We've seen some companies lay on shuttle buses for their workforce to bring them in, but also think very carefully about what the mechanism is to get to work and how they might subsidize that to bring people in an appropriate way. At work, I won't dwell on this right now because we're going to go into a couple of examples on that, but there's a lot to do in the workplace. The commonplaces also. So many organizations have had to rethink their meeting rooms in terms of the cleaning protocols in the meeting rooms, having signs outside the door after it's been used, it gets cleaned every time, protocols that have full social distancing, people wearing masks in the room, setting them up for video conferencing, so some people can be remote, some people not. Break rooms, a lot of break rooms have had to be closed, or machines, coffee machines and so on, closed off. And in some places, the break rooms closed, or at the very minimum, stagger the people going into the break rooms. Restrooms is another place where we've had to, in many essential businesses, increase the proportion of cleaning 6 or 7 times versus before. So there's a whole series of routines that happen there. And post-infection, I think Mihir will talk a little bit about this, but it is of critical importance that as you go into this, that you have people track and trace and that you think about pods. I'm going to talk a little bit about schools actually for a moment, because one of the most critical things to help people get back to work is opening up childcare. One of the things that the people who've done this successfully, the Danish communities have done this pretty successfully, they've actually segmented the children into groups. So they might have half the class in the class, and they're socially distanced. And then when they're in the playground, they might take half again, so it's a quarter of the class. So you end up in physical contact with a quarter of the class. Let's call it 5 families. And those 5 families can then associate with each other in school and then somewhat outside of school. The same kind of idea can happen here. If you can minimize the interconnectivity with people and put them into pods, it helps with this track and tracing. It helps minimize outbreaks if it happens, and allows you to shut down components of your facility in a more sustainable way than not. Some other things people have done, again, to minimize interaction is have red team, blue team, have one come in one day or 1 week, and the following come in the following week. There's a number of things that have happened there. Let me move to the next page and actually go to an example. This is a retail example, and I'll touch on a couple of these things. But I think one of the things that's been incredible about particularly our grocery retailers who have been essential businesses throughout this and wanted to keep us healthy, keep their employees healthy, and understand what it would take to go. So there's a couple of examples here, but I'm going to talk a bit about some other things that they've done. Education for sure has been an enormous part of it. They have literally educated all of their people. They have signs everywhere, signs in the back rooms, signs in the front rooms. They're maintaining hygiene as people come in and come out. So washing their hands coming in, sanitizing as they come in, so on and so forth. They've also done things, essentially reviewed all of their stores, and you could do the same in your workplace, and say, where are the high-touch areas? Where are the places where people are going to be in contact, either physical contact or multiple touch points? So take the carts, for example. They're sanitizing the carts before and after everybody has used them, so that's a high-touch area. If you think about the hot bar where you might have gone and picked up some hot food, that's an area that's open to contamination. So they've shut those down and instead packaged up some hot food instead. They've also thought about how they manage their employees. And so sick leave, which at times can be, they've essentially got a no questions asked sick leave policy to encourage people to be very comfortable taking sick leave. These are people sometimes on minimum wage, frequently on better than minimum wage through this period, but clearly people for whom sick benefits really matter, and therefore sick leave has been approved in a very different way than previously. The checkouts are obviously a very high touch, very high volume, high proximity area, and you'll have seen probably yourselves the plexiglass that's gone up everywhere. People are now starting to burst in offices and not just in the checkout areas. That's an important way to protect people. But I also think they've thought about the way people move around the building. So they've got an exit and entry doors signposted. They've got outside the doors. One of my favorite things, at the height of the pandemic in some places, they had only opened their stores for the first hour to seniors or vulnerable people so that they felt safe. And I would go to the supermarket and see people queuing up outside, and they had decals on the floor, all 6 feet apart, so everybody could queue in an orderly manner, in a safe manner. They did the same down the aisles, so had some aisles which were one way and some that were another way, and people took an orderly maneuver around the store so that you didn't have people coming into each other in carts coming into close proximity. And then, of course, the bathrooms. The bathroom hygiene regime has been extraordinarily changed, so it's literally an every 15-minute clean, or as soon as somebody's been in or out. There's an awful lot that's gone on, and you'll see on our website actually a full list of practices. I think there's over 100 that they've adopted. But I'm going to hand over to Mihir, who'll share a manufacturing example for you to give you a different environment.
So on the manufacturing side, we have seen a similar set of initial interventions put in place, right? Everything from pushing for the use of masks, et cetera. A couple of interesting things we have seen is that the nature of these interventions, back to the question on behaviors that was posed before, are very different depending on the region that you're talking about, right? In Asia, for example, you saw a much higher emphasis on temperature checks. That has been much more varied in Europe and parts of the United States because of concerns around data privacy, concerns that may not be logged correctly, issues like that. So the way that each of these things were picked up and applied are different. The other thing that we are seeing is a continued calibration and recalibration as different companies become acquainted, right? So earlier, initially, if you it felt like it was a bit of a march to how many interventions could we possibly pack into the day, right? And then when people quickly realized that doing too many of them will actually lead to lower productivity, and then they pulled back on it. But then, and they went to having fewer interventions. They realized that some of those interventions, maybe they pulled back a bit too much. They saw some growth in COVID cases. They had to recalibrate. So you do see this cycle of continuous learning and recalibration that continues, informed partly by newer challenges, right? Informed partly by fatigue from a compliance standpoint. That's a very, very powerful force, right? Or risk normalization. The ability to sort of witch away the danger on a day-to-day basis is a very powerful force. These are natural human biases that many risk behavior folks are very familiar with. And you've certainly seen a lot of those in this pandemic, particularly as it has dragged on in different geographies. Right? You tended to see the biggest compliance and the most rigid enforcement in geographies that were able to time bound their response. And as time goes by, that enforcement has become harder and harder for reasons of disruption, productivity, and risk normalization. Moving to the and this, by the way, is a great example, right? To make the point, what you see here. Let me just take a couple of lines to reduce the complexity here. But the line that is the light blue line this is a U.S. example. Are parts of the U.S. that reopened. It's not the lightest blue. It's the one that says the lightest blue are parts of the U.S. that reopened relatively, relatively quickly after they got to their peak, And you see that the line hardly drops, right? It goes to about a 10% drop, and it more or less stays there and goes up from there. And compare that to the very light blue, almost white line, which talks about reopening at less than 25% of the peak, right? And that line goes down to almost a 30% decrease in mobility. And this mobility that we are talking about here, by the way, is indoor discretionary mobility that involves lower social distancing. So that's what we are tracking here. And that indoor mobility, you're seeing a significantly greater drop and increase. And you see the point on the x-axis that marks the 0. That point is when reopening actually happened for that particular state, right? And what we quickly see that for almost irrespective of geography, you saw a growth in mobility that started well before reopening was officially underway. It's purely the rate at which it happened that was different, right? And this just goes to show the point that in many cases, regardless of political divides, regardless of other differences, the simple reality of fatigue related to shutdown is a very powerful force that is driving people to make what many would consider riskier decisions just to get past that sense of boredom. Let's keep moving here. And this example of, by the way, fatigue and so on is, I would argue, fits in the last category here, but it's one of 4 forces that impact a decision around return. And the way we think about it, return, by the way, you could call it shift to the next normal operating model or what have you. But the way we think about it, there are 4 changes in the environment that will, to some degree, continue over the next 2 years. One fact that institutions have to live with is a huge shift in demand. Whether it is a shift from remote to digital, from in-person to digital shopping for many categories, whether it is overall lower consumptions because of the recessionary effect, whether it is a preference for more homebound type spending versus and more health-based spending than the spending that we were seeing before, more conspicuous consumption spending has gone down. So you see a shift in the nature of spending, and you see a lot of that metamorphosis of demand that is happening right now, both on the B2B as well as the B2C side, which is going to continue. You're seeing a huge gap in supply versus demand on the workforce side. A shift to remote, which is, again, by the way, its own subject of calibration and recalibration. Governments around the world have put more than $10 trillion into economies, more than 3 times that what was put into economies during 2008, 2009, during that recession. That kind of money doesn't come without strings attached, obviously. And so there is a real question on how does that impact a company's operating model? How does that impact an institution's operating model? What are the conditions that will come as that? Everything from nearshoring of supply chains to other conditions that companies will have to learn to navigate. And then finally, you have a question on an understanding of the virus itself, similar to whether it is a deeper understanding of how people are behaving in different, as the virus continues, whether it's an understanding of newer options of treatment, advancements on the vaccine front. All of these different pieces will continue to change and impact the next year to 18 months, right, and beyond. So these are the 4 forces, and we think what institutions really need to think about doing is, as you think about the next normal, as you think about the post-pandemic world, whatever name you are giving it, you have to think about what is the operating model that you really have for the next 2 years, right? And that's what the next speech starts to talk about. And if you wouldn't mind moving by one, and this is the bottom line, right? The way we think about it, return is a muscle and not a plan. Many companies around the world are thinking about return fundamentally as, hey, this is what phase 1 is, this is what phase 2 is, this is what phase 3 is. But when you actually speak to the people that are in charge of this, and you get them behind closed doors, they're very clear that what they're putting down effectively is a straw man, that they have no idea, how survivable that is. Let's say if there is a resurgence in the fall, if cases go much higher in the fall, what does this plan really look like, right? They don't know, right? And so the more we thought about it, the more we realized is that what you really want is to acknowledge that these forces are going to be around in some way, shape, or form. And that will just mean that you have to build a certain, the three capabilities in particular, right, in order to navigate and in order to get to this post-pandemic world. The first is to solve for speed in your operating model. Companies have been much faster, much more productive. That's a combination of the fact that people were anxious and in a crisis mode, as well as the fact that remote working actually helped accelerate and break down some of the boundaries that exist in organizations on a day-to-day basis. So how do you actually strengthen that lesson around speed and the fast twitch muscle that people are using? How do you also increase the pace and quality of skill building, right? Earlier, you could have journeys and you could think building in months or years for a particular class of our employees. Now it is much more about how do you build skill at pace and at scale. And by the way, the skill that you're trying to build may shift, right? Where you could rely on your B2B sales force build to create an ability to form new relationships over time. Now that has become much more online, so you have to train them on that. And by the way, the day after, it might become much more hybrid, so they have to think in terms of omni-channel and not just on. So how do you actually navigate that and think about at pace, at scale capability building? And then the third big question is there is a massive amount of the increase in uncertainty also comes with an increase in data. And the challenge that we are finding for decision makers is not lack of the underlying data itself, but in lack of an understanding of how do you actually use that data to make business decisions. And there's lots of interesting insights, and people talk about use cases, and maybe if we do it, this could be interesting. But there is work involved to embed the capability of decision making, of data interpretation, of bounding the uncertainty. And how do you actively do that, right? There's work required within the organization and in the organizational setup to do it. So those are the three capabilities that we think organizations fundamentally have to build. This is one view for the how to do it. I won't spend a ton of time on this page except to point out that we think that a lot of this needs to be embedded in the day-to-day, which is what is in the white bubbles on the right-hand side, is the regular setup of the organization needs to embed a new capability to manage this. But it might help to form a dedicated team around planning ahead, and which is actively looking at the external environment, which is creating hypotheses about what the future could look like, not the future 5 years from now, but the relatively immediate, what does this look like 3 months, 6 months, a year from now, and saying, okay, based on this, here are the scenarios, right? And then basically bounding the uncertainty into something that you can start to have a point of view on. And one of the things that we are encouraging companies to do is to think about their strategy, think about the bold moves that come out of this in terms of triggers. So you have a strategic action that you could do, whether it is a divestment, whether it's an acquisition, whether it is other things like that. But think of it in terms of what is the trigger in the market that you are going to wait for, and be explicit about that trigger, even though you don't know the exact shape of it. And then when that trigger happens, that's when you bring it back up and say, okay, are we ready to press play? And then you move quickly on that, right? So having that kind of trigger-based operating model is something that allows an organization to be much more proactive in the face of uncertainty versus reacting when the disruption has happened, right? And we think embedding that as part of the standard operating model is going to be important. The next double click a little bit is on how do you actually think about that data, right? So we think that there is a lot of curated, we're calling it micro data here, but whether you're talking about public health conditions on the COVID side, whether you're talking about consumer behavior, a lot of this is available, and what matters is the organization's ability to digest it and not make it a black box. And so taking that data, having a hypothesis about what the future evolution of the COVID situation, as well as the broader sector-specific or company-specific situation looks like, and then continuously using these pieces to update things like your customer messaging, update your strategic actions. All of that is going to be critical. So it's about taking that data and using that in decision-making already. Thank you.
Mihir, we are a little bit over time, but we've had several versions of the same question. So I'd just like to close with one question, which is, if I could synthesize it, sort of what are the main gaps within this framework? Where do the challenges or the main gaps lie for organizations? And how should they best zero in on them at the same time that they're, struggling with their day-to-day challenges?
Yeah. So maybe if we can go back up a couple of slides, we can talk to that. But yeah, this is fine. So I would say there are a few challenges, right? I would say the biggest challenge that we are in the middle of having conversations of right now is, hey, should we go back to work in person or not? And the choices between, there are two where they say, hey, let's go back to work and we'll figure it out from there. Well, when I say not go back to work, but go back to the workplace and let's figure it out from there. There's a camp that says that. And there's a second camp that says, look, we are remote right now. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to build a competitive advantage that will sustain us. And so let's figure out how do we transition from remote directly without going the in-person route. And then both camps, by the way, have very good arguments, points of view for why they have adopted what they have adopted. But if you ask me what they're finding most challenging right now is to answer that question. And that's the question we get extremely commonly right now. The reality, though, is that when you probe one level under that question, there are all kinds of other issues that come up. There are issues around a fear of losing competitive advantage. There is a fear of losing culture within the organization and the sense of connectedness that people have to the culture. There is a fear of not adequately managing risk. And these fears, by the way, vary quite dramatically among different people within the organization. So if you ask us what is the biggest challenge and what is top of mind for people right now, it's probably that. The second big challenge that is on top of mind is this fear of we are in the middle of a virus. The virus could drive a recession that takes years and not months to get past. How do we survive? And how do we make sure that we don't become one of the companies that either has to be bailed out or has to declare bankruptcy or something like that? How do we actually use this as an opportunity versus the opportunity in the sense to become more competitive, rather than just allowing us to be absorbed by the waves? So I would say those are the two biggest questions that we're getting and people have right now.
Very helpful. We've had a lot of great questions, and I think what we might do is answer some of them and post them when we post the recording of today's sessions, because we haven't had as much time today. Mihir, Virginia, great discussion. We appreciate your taking the time to speak with us today. On behalf of Mackinsey Live, we thank all of you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed the conversation. We look forward to your feedback in this super quick 10-second survey that will appear when you close your event console. Please visit our website, mckinsey.com, for more on resetting for the next normal post-COVID-19, and be sure to register for next week's webinar. The COVID recovery will be digital. See you there, and have a great day or evening. Be well.